Now let's talk about the Pacific Offensive. So, concurrently, while the European campaign is going on, there's also a Pacific campaign or a campaign against the Japanese. So, we're going to pick up in 1944. Um, in 1944, there are a series of victories that are made that help us get continually closer and closer and closer to Japan, the actual four main islands of Japan. Um, but we have to break into what's called the Japanese Empire. So in February 1944, we start actually breaking into the perimeter of the Japanese Empire. And one of the first victories that allows us to do this is the Marshall Islands. There are battles over the Marshall Islands around the perimeter of the Japanese Empire, and this allows us to get in closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to Japan. So eventually, the goal is to get right up to the Japanese mainland and hopefully not have to, but if we do, stage a full-scale invasion of Japan. So the Marshall Islands really allow us to do that. Also, while we're doing this, submarine warfare is going on. American submarines are attacking Japanese vessels. Now, that's a big reversal from earlier where German submarines were attacking Allied vessels. Now, the tides have turned, or really the roles have switched, and America is attacking Axis ships. And we're sinking large amounts of Axis ships, particularly Japanese ships, to the point where Japanese supplies are really diminishing in Japan. The Japanese people were on rations during World War II, especially in 1944 and onward, and our raids on their ships with submarine warfare, sinking their ships, had done such damage to their supply lines that the citizens' rations had to be cut by 25%. And at this point in time, the rations were already pretty scant. They weren't like, it wasn't like everyone got tons and tons of food every day. They were on survival rations, and then those got cut down by 25% because of submarine warfare. Something that's going on while we're trying to invade Japan is, remember, Japan had invaded China. So now the Americans send representatives over to try to get the Chinese to fight back. So we send over people to train the Chinese to try to fight back against the Japanese. However, this really never happens. It's an abortive attempt. We basically send a guy over, and he interacts with Chiang Kai-shek, who we're going to talk about later, because once World War II is over, we're going to see the communist revolution happen in China, and Chiang Kai-shek is trying to fight it. Really, his main concern is, let's fight communism in China right now instead of fighting the Japanese. And the Americans are getting angry, saying, the Japanese are the biggest threat right now, and Chiang Kai-shek is saying, no, it's the communists. So we kind of got angry with China. We're still going to support them. Particularly, we're going to support the Chinese nationals as they fight against the Chinese communists later. But for now, it would have helped us significantly had the Chinese fought against the Japanese and gotten them out of the Chinese mainland, but that just didn't happen. Now, moving away from China's role, or really their lack of a role, at least as far as the Allies are concerned, and really as far as the Axis is concerned, so they didn't play a major role, but moving away from that to the Allied role in the Pacific Campaign, as we get to mid-June of 1944, we start making further and further and further progress toward Japan. We capture the Mariana Islands. We retake Guam, which, if you remember, after Pearl Harbor, very shortly after Pearl Harbor, Japan had taken Guam from us, which was a U.S. territory, and it still is to this day. But it's still a U.S. territory because we took it back from Japan in World War II. One of the biggest naval engagements, if not the biggest naval engagement in modern naval history, if not in all of naval history, so this is a massive engagement here, is the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It's Leyte, it's in the Philippines. And these were 3 different encounters in one major battle, where we pretty much encounter all of Japan's naval force, if not all of it, the vast majority of it. And we sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. This is devastating to Japan. We have several aircraft carriers now as a modern nation. Most modern nations don't even have an aircraft carrier. Those that do have 1, maybe 2. So looking back, we sank 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers just in this battle alone. And we devastated them so bad that they pretty much had no means with which to fight us anymore. They could pick us off little at a time with destroyers or other battleships, but they didn't have enough of a navy left after this battle to put up much of a fight. Now, we're going to have a lot of different engagements where we're fighting soldiers that are stationed on islands like Iwo Jima, but after this battle, their navy's decimated. So now let's talk about Iwo Jima. February 1945. Iwo Jima is only 750 miles from Tokyo, so we're making progress. We're getting there. It is the costliest single battle ever for the Marine Corps. So the Marines land on Iwo Jima, and this is where you see the picture. It's the iconic picture of the soldiers raising the flag. There are several soldiers struggling to get the flag up. That's from Iwo Jima. And in this single battle, the Marines suffered over 25,000 casualties. And they never before or since have, in one single battle, had casualties this bad. But they took the island. Now, Okinawa is the next major conflict. And Okinawa, it's a small island south of Japan, and it's less than 400 miles from Japan, from Tokyo, really. And we fought for Okinawa, but this is where the bitter struggle comes in, because the Japanese are sending kamikaze planes now. They're suffering from shortages of oil, they're suffering from shortages of food, because we keep sinking all their ships. They don't really have any aircraft carriers worth putting out to sea because we sank them all. So they're sending these planes out, and they don't have enough fuel to get back, so these planes are going on suicide missions. And the Japanese planes would, if they carried a bomb, they would drop the bomb, and they'd turn around and they'd they'd crash into American ships. And so while we're fighting for Okinawa, Japan sends 3,500 kamikaze planes out to meet us. And they inflict very heavy losses. They damage ships, they kill soldiers, because on the destroyers, on the battleships, and on the aircraft carriers, if a kamikaze plane hits, what oil is left in it, what gasoline is left in it, explodes, and it also sends shrapnel when it crashes into the boat. And if the boat doesn't sink from the damage that's done to it, there are usually fires to put out. People are burnt during that. So it was very bad for us. And by the time we finally capture Okinawa, we suffer 50,000 casualties. Now, however, over 100,000 Japanese died during our battle for Okinawa. So we inflict heavier damages than they inflict on us, but we still take heavy losses. And if we are to invade Japan itself, we can expect the same kind of vicious fighting. Now, culturally, this is important to understand. Your book doesn't cover this, but culturally, it was very shameful for the Japanese to surrender. Sometimes they would take as heavy of losses as 90% before they would give up, and oftentimes they wouldn't even give up. But if a unit fighting today takes losses around 30% or higher, oftentimes they'll surrender. The Japanese, when we were fighting for Okinawa and Iwo Jima and other places, they would take losses as high as 90% of their platoon or their division before they would surrender. Anyway, so we're expecting a very fierce resistance if we have to land men on Japan. But once we get past Okinawa, the Japanese pretty much give up any kind of naval resistance because they don't have anything left to resist with. So we sail along Japan and we just start bombing with impunity. We're unchallenged. We start shelling industrial locations, military locations by sea, and no one's resisting us. Now we get into one of probably the most controversial aspects of World War II, which is the Manhattan Project and the dropping of the bomb. Now, I'm going to Skype in a few minutes, and we're going to discuss for the remaining time in the class the decision to drop the bomb, its implications, and different viewpoints of that. But anyway, the issue at hand once we get near Japan is, do we send soldiers in? And do we risk lives that we don't have to risk? Now, the Manhattan Project was started in the early 40s. Really, before this, there were rumors that German scientists were working on atomic warfare. They were trying to develop weapons that made the theory of critical mass with radioactive materials a reality. Now, your book says that Albert Einstein had warned Franklin Roosevelt about the possibility of atomic warfare. Now, this is true, but your book leaves out Oppenheimer, who's also largely responsible for this. So Oppenheimer and Einstein are both influential in the Manhattan Project and getting Roosevelt to realize the potential that's here. But anyway, moving on to the Manhattan Project, there are professors from Columbia University that start working on making the atomic bomb a reality. And they work in several different locations, Los Alamos being the most famous one. Oak Ridge, Tennessee as well, which is kind of strange. Like, you don't think that in the Smoky Mountains area that people would be working on atomic bombs, but they were. By the way, just a quick shout out to the Oak Ridge Boys, who they grew up in Oak Ridge, and they were a band that came out of there that was relatively popular in the 60s, which was home of part of the Manhattan Project. But anyway, by July of 1945, we had our first bomb to test. Now, it's too late because if you remember VE Day, it's too late to try it in Europe. But we're still fighting in Japan. So by July 16th, 1945, we have the first nuclear test or atomic test, and this is of the bomb named Trinity. And this bomb is detonated out in the desert, in the proving grounds, and it's unlike anything we'd ever experienced. I mean, they tested to have a measurement for this. They made an explosion with massive amounts of dynamite. I think it was 100 tons. 100,000 tons. I'm sorry, 100,000 tons of dynamite. I think it was. I'll need to look that up when we Skype in here. But massive amounts of dynamite just to be able to test the power of this bomb. So anyway, we have the bomb, and now Truman is president because during this time period in April, FDR passes away. And Truman is president, and he has to make the decision, what do we do with this thing? We've got the bomb. He didn't even know about it before he became president, but what do we do with it? By the way, just a little side note, something you may be interested in. Before we developed the atomic bomb, there's a podcast about this. You can look up websites. Our real weapon that we were going to use was the bat bomb. No joke. They were tying tiny napalm charges to bats, and they were going to release them in Japan and try to burn down most of Tokyo. But anyway, the Useless Information podcast, free on iTunes. They've got an episode on the bat bomb. True story. Check it out. It's kind of cool. But anyway, atomic warfare. So Truman has to decide, what do we do here? Do we risk hundreds of thousands of soldiers? The estimates are probably about 500,000 U.S. soldiers are going to die invading Japan and taking it back. Or do we just drop the bomb and be done with it? So for Truman, it was pretty much a very easy military decision. He decides, why not? Let's drop the bomb. We have it. It's going to save lives. So he makes the call. He warns them first. He warns the Japanese that they're going to face basically utter annihilation if they don't surrender by August 3rd. The date for surrender goes past. August 6th, the Enola Gay flies over, drops a bomb on Hiroshima. And then we wait 2 days later, we drop a bomb on Nagasaki. And then August 14th, Japan starts softening up and they say, okay, we're gonna discuss this surrender thing. And by September 2nd, they sign the Articles of Surrender. So it does lead to the ultimate surrender of Japan. The question is, was it ethical to do? Which is what I'm going to Skype in here in a second to talk about.